I was standing at the edge of a conference room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and new carpet, watching a handshake dissolve into awkward silence. The other man, an investor I had pitched everything to, smiled politely, closed his folder, and left without scheduling a follow-up. I remember the sharp heat behind my eyes, not from anger, but from a sudden, painful clarity. I knew my product, my numbers, my slides. What I did not know was how to move the single invisible thing separating me from yes. I had built competence by the book, but I had not built connection. That silence cost me more than one missed check. It cost momentum, reputation, and the quiet confidence that comes from being able to engage people and make things happen. That moment pushed me in a direction I hadn't planned. I started asking different questions. Not, what feature do I add? But, why did his eyes glance away when I asked about risk? Why did he mirror my posture unconsciously? Why did a brief comment from a colleague shift the room's energy 2 degrees and then stay there? I read papers late into the night, listened to interviews with social psychologists, and, more importantly, began testing small hypotheses in real life. The tests were messy. I failed often. I learned faster. What I discovered, again and again, was that human behavior isn't mystical, it's patterned. Behind what feels like whim are a handful of regular discoverable principles: threat detection, reciprocity, social proof, status dynamics, emotional contagion. Learn to see them, and you reshape outcomes. Neglect them, and excellence in your field may never translate into influence or leadership. I tell people now that my wealth, what others call success, was less the result of luck or genius, and more the result of learning a social language that nearly everyone misunderstands. This isn't a story about tricks. It's a story about learning to notice, to respond, and to create mutual value by aligning what you want with what others genuinely respond to. I want to show you how I did it, the habits I built, the mistakes that taught me the most, and the repeatable practices I used to translate psychological insight into everyday influence. Let me start with 5 hidden principles I call the pillars of social fluency. Each one changed the way I moved through rooms, conversations, and deals. Each one is grounded in decades of research. I'm going to translate the science into what to look for and how to act. After each principle, I'll share a short story from my early experiments and one practical exercise you can try immediately. Use them responsibly. Your advantage should create value, not exploit vulnerability. The first principle: threat detection. How people scan for safety before they engage. Early on, I thought objections were purely logical. Someone lists reasons, and you counter them with better reasons. I learned that most objections are first and foremost emotional signals of threat. The body reacts before the mind constructs an argument. In one early negotiation, an executive abruptly folded his arms and leaned away midway through my pitch. I had been rattling through data, eyes fixed on a slide, oblivious to the small tightening of his jaw and the subtle retreat. He wasn't rejecting the concept. He felt cornered. When I finally paused and asked, "What are your main concerns?" he exhaled and told me about a previous deal that had burned him. That moment of naming the risk shifted the room from defensive to collaborative. Neuroscientists describe systems like the amygdala and the insular cortex as early warning processes. They flag potential threat and bias our attention towards safety. The prefrontal cortex does the slower, rational work. What matters for influence is timing. If you trigger the alarm early, through rushed eye contact, aggressive framing, or a tone that feels coercive, you'll rarely get to the rational conversation that follows. If you signal safety first, the rational mind will be open to weighing evidence. A simple tactic I used: begin with a safety signal, a short, disarming question, or a small concession that recalibrates the other person's state. In my case, that looked like starting some meetings with an unexpected piece of information that benefits the other party, or an honest acknowledgement of my own uncertainty. These small signals stop the defensive cascade. They tell the other person, this is not a threat. Practice task: In your next conversation, watch for any of these microsigns: arms folding, jaw tightening, shoulders rising, a voice that shortens. If you see any, pause and ask one open question that names the concern. Something like, "I sense this might not fit. What's your main worry?" Aim for curiosity, not defense. The second principle, reciprocity, the social economy of favors. There's an old story in my circle about a conference where I met a senior partner in a field adjacent to mine. I went in wanting an introduction, and I left with a mentorship. The difference? I had given something small first, not a sales pitch, not a favor with strings, but a genuine, useful insight, a brief analysis of a competitor's emerging strategy. It cost me 20 minutes, but it signaled that I was a collaborator, not a taker. Weeks later, when I needed a warm introduction, he thought of me. Reciprocity is one of the most reliable social rules. People feel a powerful, almost automatic pull to respond in kind to kindness. Social psychologists have documented this across cultures. Small gifts and concessions create a felt obligation. In business settings, reciprocity looks like offering help before asking for it, sharing useful information freely, or structuring early conversations to focus on the other person's interests. But there's an ethical border to respect. Reciprocity should not be used to bind someone into a manipulative obligation. The intent matters. I used reciprocity to open doors and to build credibility, not to engineer indebtedness. When people experienced my early gestures as sincere, they were more likely to reciprocate in ways that created real mutual value: referrals, advice, introductions. Tactic: practice first payoff gestures that require low effort for you and real utility for them. An introduction, a brief analysis, or a piece of research can prime reciprocal behaviors without imposing. Practice task: identify one person you want to build a relationship with. Give them something small and useful this week, no strings attached, and observe how the dynamic shifts over the following month. Record what changed in their responsiveness or tone. The third principle, social proof, how people use others to decide what to do. One evening I walked into a packed launch party for a product I barely understood. People clustered around a demo station and kept nodding. I remember thinking, the product can't be that good. Why is everyone positive? Then I realized I was seeing a social shortcut. When uncertain, humans borrow the choice of others. In business, social proof shows up as testimonials, visible endorsements, or even a room full of engaged attendees. But social proof can be fragile. Fake it, and you destroy trust. Researchers have traced social proof to our species' reliance on social learning. Copying others reduces the cognitive load of making complex choices. In practical terms, social proof is currency. If the right people vouch for you, others are more comfortable following. I learned to cultivate genuine forms of social proof, case studies I had permission to share, testimonials from clients who were comfortable speaking publicly, and visible partnerships that reflected real relationships. I avoided inflated metrics or manufactured endorsements. Those offer short-term lifts and long-term harm. Tactic: curate legitimate proof points. Invite a satisfied client to speak, publish a short case study, or highlight small verifiable wins that demonstrate value. Social proof should make it easier for people to predict the future with you. Practice task: list 3 real people, clients, colleagues, or partners who can speak to your work. Ask one of them for a short public quote or a brief recorded comment you can share. Keep the request humble and specific. The fourth principle, status and hierarchy, how people read, rank, and respond to signals. Status is a dance. It's not only about titles or money. It's about signals, confidence, restraint, generosity, the ability to make others feel seen. Early in my career, I tried 2 approaches: aggressive self-promotion that edged toward arrogance, and near invisibility that came from worrying about how I looked. Neither worked. I learned that projecting status effectively is less about dominating and more about balancing presence with deference. The high-status posture is to be calm under pressure, to speak deliberately, and to offer attention to others rather than demand it. Status signals are passed unconsciously: posture, ease of voice, the rhythm of speech, and how a person treats interruption. Social neuroscience suggests that status cues influence others' physiological responses and decision-making processes. But cultural norms matter. What signals status in one context may read differently in another. In some cultures, direct eye contact is a sign of confidence. In others, it can be disrespectful. Calibrate. Tactic. Practice status projection through what I call centered delivery. Lower your pitch slightly, slow your cadence, and ask one thoughtful question that redirects attention to someone else. The goal is to create a presence that feels stable, rather than self-obsessed. Practice task. Record a short 2-minute version of how you describe what you do. Edit it to remove filler words and speed. Practice delivering it with a slightly slower cadence and a lower pitch. Notice how listeners respond when you shift pace and tonality. The fifth principle, emotional contagion, the invisible spread of mood. I remember a meeting where everything felt thin and rushed. Fast speech, clipped laughter, people checking their phones. I left deflated. By contrast, I sat in another session months later, and the room was buoyant. People smiled easily, leaned in, and the conversation accelerated. The difference often came down to one person who set the emotional tone. Emotions are social. They spread through micro-expressions, vocal cues, and posture. Mirror neurons and other brain systems, while their precise operations are debated, help explain why we pick up moods from others. Emotional contagion can be a force for good. A calm leader can steady a team. Genuine enthusiasm can energize a crowd. But it can also escalate negativity if unrecognized. I learned to manage my internal state before entering important rooms. I developed short rituals, breathing patterns, mental reframes, and a simple 3-breath reset, so that I arrived with composure rather than reactivity. Tactic. Before important interactions, practice a 2-minute state check. Name your emotional goal: calm, curious, confident. Breathe to regulate arousal and imagine the room responding to that state. Small shifts in your physiology significantly influence the group's mood. Practice task. Before your next meeting, take 2 minutes to label your emotion. Breathe into a steady count of 4 and set an intention for how you want the room to feel. After the meeting, jot down whether the room matched your intention and what you did that influenced it. Those 5 principles, threat detection, reciprocity, social proof, status signaling, and emotional contagion, became the toolkit I carried into negotiations, sales meetings, and leadership moments. Each principle operates beneath conscious awareness, but becomes actionable once you can see and influence the signals. They don't promise instant success. They increase the probability that your competence will be heard and that your offers will be considered. After a few weeks of deliberate practice, I noticed a subtle transformation. People started returning my calls more quickly. Meetings that had once stretched awkwardly into silence now progressed to outcomes. Most importantly, I felt less exhausted by social friction. Scanning for patterns reduced the cognitive load of every interaction. That new capacity allowed me to devote attention to larger strategic problems.
If you're listening and want to try these ideas with structure, there's a short workbook that accompanies this audiobook with exercises for these 5 principles, simple prompts you can use during the week. It's in the episode notes if you want to download it and test the exercises as you go.
I don't want to romanticize the process. My early attempts were clumsy. I gave away a proprietary model to a potential partner, thinking reciprocity would lock him in. Instead, he left with a plan and no obligation to return my call. I misread status in a multinational room and leaned into directness where softness was required. Those failures mattered because they forced reflection. Every mistake showed me what not to do and pushed me to refine my calibration. One memory of failure still stings. I had secured a chance to present to a board that could fund the expansion of a product I believed in. I prepared relentlessly: slides, data, counter-answers. The morning of, I found myself wired, pacing in the hallway of the building where the meeting would be held. My nervous energy leaked into my voice at the start. The board members listened, but their faces remained closed. Midway, a director interrupted with a blunt question about risk. My response was defensive. My voice rose a register. By the end, the mood had hardened. We didn't get the commitment. Afterward, a mentor told me bluntly, "You won the facts months ago. Now you have to win them emotionally." That sentence reframed my approach. Facts convince. Emotional safety allows facts to land. That failure led me to study how the brain responds under stress and what leaders can do to regulate their own state. It became the doorway into a deeper understanding of what I call the social brain. This is neither pop neuroscience nor lightweight advice. It's practical. It connects physiology to outcomes. In the next section, we'll unpack how fragile decisions are when people are in a heightened state and the interventions that help create clarity. But before we move there, I want to give you 3 short exercises to embed the 5 principles, simple, repeatable moves you can do this week. Practice sequence. Observe. In 2 daily interactions this week, mentally note which of the 5 principles seems most active. Did someone signal threat? Was reciprocity at play? Write 1 line about what you noticed. Act. Choose 1 principle and practice its tactic once. For example, in a short conversation, offer a small, useful insight freely, reciprocity, or start by naming a concern you sense, threat detection. Reflect. After each interaction, spend 1 minute noting what changed. Did the tone shift? Did the other person open up? Be honest about mistakes. Calibration is built on feedback. These tasks are small because learning social fluency isn't about grand gestures. It's about accumulating small, correct behaviors until they become habit. The practices above are designed to create that accumulation without costing your time or ethical grounding. As I moved to the next stage of learning, I realized that understanding these principles required a map of the machinery beneath them, the social brain. People hear terms like amygdala and mirror neurons in passing, and it's easy to be seduced by the vocabulary without gaining practical insight. I focused on a few core ideas that translated neurologically into actionable habits. First, humans are predictive processors. Our brain constantly builds models of what will happen next, and it updates those models based on incoming information. Those predictions prioritize safety and social cohesion. Second, affect and cognition are intertwined. Feelings color judgment long before reason arrives. Third, our capacity for regulation, how well we can shift from a reactive state to a reflective state, determines our social effectiveness in high-stakes situations. I began experimenting with techniques to influence my own nervous system before walking into rooms. Short breath work, a 2-minute visualization of a calm, competent self, and micro behaviors like grounding my feet before starting a conversation. I learned that these practices didn't make me perfect. They gave me a reliable baseline from which to respond rather than react. One experiment stands out. I had a recurring problem. In video calls with potential partners, I would speak quickly and my energy would spike, creating a tempo that made others talk over me or tune out. I started a ritual. 5 slow breaths, a brief note to myself. Be curious, not convincing, and a conscious effort to lower my pitch by just a fraction. The first few times I felt awkward. People at the other end commented that I sounded more composed. Over time, the rhythm of video calls changed. Conversations became deeper, and decisions trended toward collaboration rather than confrontation. The neuroscience offers guardrails, not prescriptions. Studies suggest the amygdala reacts to threats before the cortex evaluates them, and that mirror systems support emotional resonance. But it's important to hedge these claims. Science is iterative. The patterns are clear enough to build practical tests. When you regulate your body and set a social intention, the room more often follows. I won't lie. Mastering regulation takes practice. My first attempts at breathwork felt like theater. But repetition produced a different outcome. The moments of being on the edge became manageable. The ability to be present, to slow down under pressure, is one of the highest leverage skills in social interaction. You can't fake presence, you cultivate it. Before I go deeper into specific tactics for regulating state and understanding brain mechanics, I want to leave you with 2 small experiments to try before our next section. They directly connect neuroscience to practice. State experiments. 2-minute grounding. 5 slow breaths with attention on the soles of your feet. Note any shift in heart rate or posture. Use it before a call or meeting. Vocal anchor. Practice speaking a single sentence about your work with a slightly lower pitch and 20% slower tempo. Notice how listeners react. Do they ask more questions? Do they match your pace? These are low-cost experiments with immediate feedback. The results are informative. When you change your physiology, people shift in response. I was only beginning to see how these building blocks fit together. The 5 hidden principles gave me a lens to read interactions. The early nervous system work gave me a way to show up differently. But influence isn't an isolated skill. It lives in structures, habits, relationships, and systems you build to scale connection. That realization led me to formulate a framework I call the 4 pillars of social intelligence. They gave me an architecture for practice, social awareness, self-management, social influence, and relationship architecture. Each pillar demanded both intellectual understanding and concrete, repeatable drills. I'll tell you how each pillar unfolded in my life and how I began converting insight into routine. But I want to pause here because the shift from theory to system is where many people stumble. You can understand principles and still fail to integrate them. My own early attempts were scattershot. I'd apply reciprocity in one conversation and ignore emotional contagion in the next. Progress required a plan. That plan began with an experiment in habit design. I took a week to map my daily social touchpoints, emails, calls, meetings, and assigned 1 micro-skill to practice in each slot. Mornings were for breathwork and voice practice. Midday calls were opportunities to apply reciprocity. Evening reflections recorded pattern recognition. Over 8 weeks, small changes compounded. What felt like a lot of deliberate effort at first became a natural repertoire. One particular week stands out. I had 3 high-stakes interactions across 3 days. A pitch to a potential investor, a tough performance review with a long-time employee, and a dinner with a prospective co-founder. I assigned a specific pillar to each event. For the pitch, social influence and framing. For the review, self-management and emotional regulation. For the dinner, relationship architecture with reciprocity at the center. The week didn't go perfectly. There were awkward moments, but the results were striking. The investor asked for a second meeting, the performance review turned into a constructive plan, and the dinner produced a genuine offer to collaborate. The lesson crystallized. The pillars are not separate. They're orchestrated. That's where I want to leave you for now. We've covered the turning point that pushed me into this work, the 5 hidden principles that form the lens of influence, a first look at the social brain and basic state regulation, and the idea of structuring practice through 4 pillars. These are the building blocks. The next section will dive deeply into the 4 pillars, with concrete templates and exercises you can use to adapt your style to different personality types and contexts. I promise practical drills, case studies where I got it wrong before I got it right, and a playbook you can test in your own life, not to force people, but to create more honest, generative exchanges. The power of influence lies in repeatable, ethical acts that scale trust. When you're ready, we'll move from seeing the seams to sewing them together, how to read individuals, tailor your approach across introverts and extroverts, and craft conversations that lead to sustainable agreements. I started by building a habit loop, a small cue, a short routine, and an immediate reflection. The cue was simple. Before any interaction that mattered, I set a timer on my phone for 30 seconds and answered 3 quick questions. What do I want from this exchange? What might the other person worry about? How do I want the room to feel? The routine was the micro skill I'd assigned for that slot. Breathwork, a specific question to open with, or a conversational frame. And the reflection was one line in my notes app about what changed. It was mundane work. The payoff was not dramatic at first, but it was cumulative. Over months, those 30-second prompts created a muscle memory for structure. I arrived with intention, chose a single skill to practice, and recorded what happened. The 4 pillars that guided those choices, social awareness, self-management, social influence, and relationship architecture, are what I want to unpack now. Each pillar is a domain to train, not a claim that you will be perfect. Treat them as fields of practice. Social awareness. Learn to see what others are actually doing. My early view of social awareness was superficial. Read faces, notice who talks most. That was a start, but the deeper skill is pattern recognition. Social awareness is the ability to notice signals, verbal and nonverbal, and infer plausible mental states while holding multiple hypotheses in mind. It's less about labeling emotions and more about asking, what is the person trying to accomplish here, and what constraints do they have? A concrete moment taught me that nuance matters. I was in a room with a prospective co-founder who kept asking practical, process-oriented questions. On the surface, it looked like cautiousness. After 3 questions about timelines, budgets, and team roles, I made the mistake of answering defensively, offering layered assurances. She smiled politely, but didn't commit. Later I realized she wasn't skeptical of the idea. She was trying to establish structure so she could evaluate operational fit. My defensive answers sounded evasive to her. Had I reframed the conversation to co-create a timeline, if we were to pilot this in 3 months, what would success look like? She likely would have engaged differently. Social awareness has 3 practical axes: attention, calibration, and hypothesis. Attention is the low-cost work of noticing voice tone, pace, posture shifts, and topical redirections. Calibration is adjusting your behavior incrementally, softer tone, different framing, or a pause. Hypothesis is verbally testing what you think is happening with curiosity rather than certainty. Tool, a simple attention checklist I used on calls. 1. Who is speaking more and why? 2. Where do pauses happen? 3. Are people nodding, frowning, looking away? 4. What assumptions seem unspoken? Practice tasks. Today, in 2 conversations, apply the attention checklist. Write 1 sentence about the strongest signal you noticed and 1 hypothesis about its cause. At the end of the day, pick 1 interaction and rehearse a single calibration you could have tried, then try it tomorrow. Self-management. Regulate your internal state so you can act with agency. This pillar is what transformed my worst presentations into recoverable moments. Self-management is both physiological and psychological. On a physiological level, it's breath, posture, and micro-habits to regulate arousal. On a psychological level, it's narrative control, the stories you tell yourself about what's at stake. A vivid example. I was scheduled to meet with a potential investor who had a reputation for being blunt. The night before, I replayed scenarios in my head and inflated the danger. I woke with a tight chest. Rather than attempt ad hoc calm, I followed a short ritual. 3 grounding breaths, a 1-sentence rehearsal of my opening framed as what I hope to learn, and a visualization of the investor as a collaborator solving a shared problem. I didn't suppress nervousness. I shifted its shape into curiosity. The meeting went differently. My questions invited dialogue, and the tone remained exploratory rather than defensive. The mechanisms here are simple. Arousal narrows cognitive bandwidth, and small regulatory practices widen it. Neuroscience suggests that when we down-regulate the amygdala's threat response, through breath and cognitive reframing, the prefrontal cortex regains access to planning and perspective. Studies suggest these effects are real, but context-dependent. Still, in practice, the interventions are low risk and high return. Tactics to practice. Anchor breath. Inhale for 4, exhale for 6, 3 rounds before any call. Micro-narrative. Replace catastrophic must-win stories with curiosity-driven frames. I want to learn whether we can help them, instead of, I must get a yes. Body reset. Stand with feet planted shoulder width, soften shoulders, and speak one sentence. Practice tasks. For 1 week, apply the anchor breath before each scheduled meeting. Record whether your rate of interruptions or reactivity changes. Create 2 micro-narratives, one for pitches, one for conflict conversations, and rehearse them aloud until they feel natural. Social influence. Shape the environment so your ideas are considered. Influence is the applied pillar. It's where framing, reciprocity, and status converge into specific moves. Ethical influence respects autonomy while making it easier for others to see the value in cooperation. I learned to think in sequences. First, reduce threat. Second, create relevance. Third, prime social proof. Fourth, invite small commitments. In a negotiation, this looks like opening with a safety signal, sharing a brief case study, social proof, proposing a low-cost trial, reciprocity, commitment, and leaving space for the other party to shape terms. One negotiation crystallized this sequence. I needed to renew a partnership where trust had frayed. I started the conversation by acknowledging the breakdown, naming it, and offering a small concession, a shortened pilot with transparent metrics. Then I shared a concise example of a similar partnership that improved through clarified expectations. Finally, I asked a calibration question. What would make a pilot feel fair to you? The partner's defensiveness melted into collaboration because we'd reduced the perceived threat, shown proof of value, and invited joint authorship. Influence is not tricks. It's a ladder you build with steps that feel reasonable to the other person. Ethical checkpoint. Treat reciprocity as an invitation, not a leash. Offer value without strings. Allow people to decline gracefully. Practice tasks. Design a 3-step influence sequence for an upcoming ask. Safety signal, concise proof point, low-cost commitment. Test the sequence in a low-stakes context and note which step needed calibration. Relationship architecture. Scale trust into systems. This pillar moved me from isolated wins to leverage. Relationship architecture is designing predictable, repeatable structures that sustain trust. Regular check-ins, transparent deliverables, public acknowledgments, and escalation paths for conflict. Think of it as engineering for relational durability. Early on, I relied on ad hoc favors and charisma to keep networks active. That was fragile. The shift came when I started to document agreements, create shared calendars, and formalize post-meeting summaries that noted decisions and next steps. Those simple artifacts drastically reduced misalignment. People followed up because the structure made doing so easy, not because they felt charmed. A practical method I used was the 3 commitments framework for partnerships. Shared metric of success, agreed communication rhythm, and a defined pilot or exit point. When each party knows how success will be measured and how they'll communicate, trust grows without continual negotiation. Practice tasks. For one ongoing relationship, write a 1-paragraph architecture: how we measure success, how we communicate, and how we resolve disagreements. Send a brief summary after your next collaborative meeting with decisions and owners. Track whether follow-through improves. Those 4 pillars, awareness, self-management, influence, and architecture, are not separate competencies you earn and shelve. They are overlapping systems you iterate on. I use them to guide daily micro-practices, weekly reflections, and quarterly experiments. Personality and adaptive communication, tailoring your approach to real people. Once the pillars were in place, the next barrier was variability. People differ in how they process information and what they need to feel safe. Early on, I treated everyone like a scaled-up version of myself, direct, rapid, and outcome-oriented. That failed with many high-performing collaborators who needed different rhythms. I settled on a quadrant approach derived from 2 axes people are comfortable with: energy orientation, introverted to extroverted, and decision preference, thinking, problem-solving to feeling relational. The 4 quadrants help you choose language, pacing, and frame. Introvert thinker, values time, clarity, and low-drama logic. Approach: lead with written outlines, give time to process, use clear metrics. Template 1. Email opener for a meeting. I'd like to discuss X. Attached are 3 options and the data behind each. Please review at your convenience and tell me which you prefer or what additional data you'd need. Template 2. Meeting framing. Start with a concise agenda. Invite silent reflection for 2 minutes before discussion, then ask for the person's prioritized concerns. Template 3. Follow-up. Send bullet-pointed next steps with deadlines. Avoid redundant enthusiasm. Introvert feeler. Values trust, psychological safety, and relational context. Approach. Build rapport slowly. Ask about their concerns. Demonstrate reliability through small commitments. Template 1. Opening question. I want to make sure this conversation is helpful for you. What outcomes would feel most valuable? Template 2. At decision points. Frame consequences for people involved, not just metrics. How would this affect your team's workload? Template 3. Follow-up. A personal note that acknowledges the relationship and summarizes commitments. Extrovert thinker. Energetic, quick, decision-oriented, enjoys debate. Approach. Match pace. Prioritize big-picture reasoning. Allow debate as a tool for refining ideas. Template 1. Meeting opener. Here's the thesis in 1 sentence. 3 reasons it could work, and 2 potential objections. Let's test them. Template 2. During negotiation, use time-boxed rounds to keep energy focused. Template 3. Follow-up. A concise status update with options for next moves. Extrovert feeler. People-oriented, expressive, seeks connection and shared momentum. Approach. Be warm and present. Honor stories. Use collaborative language. Template 1. Opening. I've been excited about this idea. Tell me what you like most so we can build on that. Template 2. Decision framing. Emphasize shared identity and the team benefits. Template 3. Follow-up. Include an appreciative line and highlight the shared wins. These templates are practical starting points. They're not scripts. Successful adaptation is less about performing and more about authentic calibration. You adjust not to manipulate, but to be understood. Practice tasks. Identify 3 people you interact with regularly and map them to quadrants. For 1 person in each quadrant, try the corresponding template in your next interaction, then record what changed in tone or outcome. First impressions, micro-expressions, body language, and vocal mastery. First impressions are the compound interest of social influence. They cascade into expectations that guide future judgments. I learned to treat first impressions as a sequence rather than a single shot. The approach, the greeting, the first 30 seconds of talk. All matter. Microsensors I use now. Orientation. Does the person face you? Paralinguistic cues, tone, pitch, rate, and micro-expressions. Fleeting eyebrow raises, mouth compressions. I do not teach you to catch lies or engage in interrogation. I teach you to notice mismatches, a smiling mouth with tense eyes, rapid blinking with a joyful claim. These are signals to ask a clarifying, gentle question. 1 instance. I arrived at an opening event conversation vibrantly, but the other attendees' smile didn't reach their eyes. Their hands were clasped tight. Instead of barreling in with a pitch, I asked a light open question about their evening. The body language softened. That small calibration turned a potential brush-off into a 10-minute exchange that led to a lunch meeting. Vocal mastery changed the way people receive proposals. I once thought fast, bright speech signaled competence. Instead, slowing and lowering my pitch, especially on the last word of a sentence, made ideas land with more weight. The contrast between speed and pause creates perceived deliberateness. People infer more competence from well-timed silence than from continuous chatter. Practical drills. Mirror and align. Practice slight mirroring of posture and tone for 30 seconds, then allow divergence. Mirroring builds rapport, but don't mimic. Do it to tune in. Vocal anchor. Choose a staple sentence. Here's the core idea. And practice delivering it at a slightly lower pitch and 20% slower. Record and compare. Micro-expression check. Notice 1 fast facial cue per conversation. If it appears, ask a curiosity question. You just paused. What crossed your mind? Cultural caveat. Eye contact, proximity, and gesture meanings differ across cultures. Use the lowest risk approach. Observe, then adapt. If someone avoids direct gaze, don't force sustained eye contact. Mirror their norm or slightly lower the intensity. Practice tasks. Before your next meeting, rehearse your vocal anchor and open with the slower cadence on your first sentence. After a conversation, note any micro-expressions you noticed and what you did in response. Principles of persuasion and an ethical negotiation case study. We've already touched on reciprocity, social proof, and framing. Here I want to bring them together into an ethical negotiation framework and walk through a case where I applied multiple principles in sequence. The framework: prepare, prime, propose, probe, and patch. Prepare. Understand interests, constraints, and alternatives. Prime. Set the psychological environment, safety signals, reciprocity, and social proof. Propose. Present an offer framed to highlight alignment and minimize perceived threat. Probe. Ask calibrated questions to uncover hidden objections. Patch. When objections arise, offer narrow, verifiable concessions and document next steps. Case study. I was negotiating with a distribution partner whose initial terms would have heavily favored them. Preparation showed they feared operational failure more than financial risk. I primed by acknowledging past issues publicly and offering a small shared guarantee, a short pilot with clear KPIs and a third-party audit. That first concession signaled reciprocity and minimized their fear. I presented the proposal framed as risk-sharing rather than profit-shifting. When they pushed back on a delivery timeline, I probed, if we shortened scope by 20%, what would that change for your capacity? Their answer revealed operational constraints I could accommodate by adjusting milestones. The patch was a narrow concession, faster initial deliverables in exchange for phased payments. The partner agreed because the sequence reduced threat, built shared responsibility, and created measurable checkpoints. Ethical checkpoint. Note the role of verification. Commitments should be auditable and reversible when necessary. Avoid promises that lock others into irreversible harm or exploit vulnerability. Practice tasks. For an upcoming ask, draft a prepare, prime, propose, probe, patch sequence. Keep each stage to one sentence. Test the sequence in a low-risk negotiation and note which step produces the most resistance: emotional contagion, hierarchy, and conflict resolution. Leading others means you sometimes set the emotional temperature and manage the social gradients of status. Emotional contagion is powerful. A leader's composure can calm, their anxiety can amplify. Hierarchy influences how openly people speak. Junior members may suppress dissent in a high-power environment. I learned to use two interventions to manage both contagion and hierarchy: the reset and the norm anchor. The reset is a simple group technique. When a team meeting becomes reactive, I pause the conversation and say, let's take 60 seconds to state the goal and one constraint we're collectively aware of. That pause often dissolves escalation because it shifts attention from blame to shared purpose. The norm anchor is a pre-agreed behavior established at the outset of a relationship. Explicit norms about who speaks first, how decisions are recorded, and how disagreement is handled. I once led a cross-functional launch where senior executives dominated every early meeting. By establishing a norm, each meeting begins with 2 minutes of silence for junior members to add written thoughts, we altered the dynamic. The change revealed problems earlier, and the launch avoided late-stage surprises. Conflict resolution in practice is less dramatic than popular narratives suggest. Good resolution follows 4 steps: surfacing the claim, separating people from problems, exploring options, and agreeing on small, testable next steps. High-status leaders model de-escalation by naming their own contributions to a problem. That humility often disarms others and invites reciprocal candor. Practice tasks. In your next team meeting, use the reset. State the goal and constraint before problem-solving. Create one norm anchor for your group and test it in a small way, e.g., a standing rule that each voice gets 1 uninterrupted minute per meeting. Charisma, advanced conversation, and trust architecture. Charisma is often billed as a mysterious gift. My experience was different. Charisma is a set of reliable behaviors that increase perceived warmth and competence. 2 consistent levers I found are amplified listening and generative framing. Amplified listening is not about nodding. It's about demonstrating that you've heard the core of someone's concern and that you can move the conversation forward on that basis. For example, after a partner explains a problem, respond with, "So the central constraint is X. If we could reduce X by half, would that change your willingness to proceed?" That signals comprehension, respect, and a drive toward solutions. Generative framing turns problems into opportunities for co-creation. Instead of saying, "Here's why this failed," say, "What if we treat this as an experiment to learn why?" Generative frames reduce defensiveness and open pathways to collaboration. Trust architecture turns repeated interactions into predictable reliability. My rules for trust were straightforward. Over-communicate expectations early, make deliverables visible, and create small, frequent wins. I used short public updates to maintain alignment and scheduled retrospectives to normalize learning. Over time, people came to expect transparency. When trust exists, influence scales. Practice tasks. Try amplified listening in 3 conversations this week. Summarize the other person's core constraint in 1 sentence and ask a solution-oriented question. Start a shared update ritual with a partner. 1 short note each week that highlights progress and 1 open risk. Climax. The integrated test that proved the system worked. The defining moment came in an unlikely place, a late-night conference hallway conversation that turned into a last-chance negotiation. It was the kind of interaction you don't plan. I had flown in after a long week. My energy was low. I found myself beside someone I had briefed months earlier, an executive with the capacity to open a major market. Back then, we had stalled over operational risks and misaligned expectations. This was my chance to re-engage. I used everything I'd practiced. First, I managed my state. A brief grounding breath and a micro-narrative. I am curious, not convincing. My calmness changed my posture. My voice came steadier. Second, I opened with a safety signal, a candid acknowledgement of prior friction and a small, unanticipated concession, an offer to run a week-long pilot at my cost with transparent metrics. Third, I provided social proof, a single, concise case study of a similar partner where the pilot revealed a low-risk path to scale. Fourth, I probed with curiosity-based questions to reveal the real constraints, not money, but their internal bandwidth and executive calendar. Fifth, I proposed a narrow patch, a 2-month pilot, 1 dashboard, and a bi-weekly check-in protocol that would pause automatically if KPIs didn't move. The executive's face changed in stages. A micro-expression, an almost imperceptible relaxation around the eyes, told me he was considering the offer. He asked 1 technical question, and I answered slowly, deliberately, grounding the answer in the pilot's audit clause. He asked for a written summary. I pulled my phone, wrote the terms as bullet points, and shared them. That act, making the agreement visible and reversible, reduced ambiguity. He signed off to loop in his team. 2 months later, the pilot exceeded the minimal KPIs and led to a phased contract. That moment wasn't a stroke of luck. It was the orchestration of pillars, regulated state, calibrated awareness, ethical influence, and a trust-building architecture. The deal didn't guarantee riches. It opened a channel that, over time, contributed meaningfully to growth. More importantly, it felt right. The partner had agency. We had transparency. Value was testable and mutual. Sustaining mastery. A long-term practice plan. If there's one thing success taught me, it's that competence without maintenance decays. The social skills that amplified my professional life required ongoing practice, reflection, and ethical checks. Here is a plan I used and refined over several years, a sustainable modular routine you can adapt. Daily micro-practices, 10-15 minutes total, morning 2-minute state check, breath, anchor sentence, and a specific intention for the day. Midday calibration. In one interaction, apply a chosen pillar, e.g., practice reciprocity in an email. Evening reflection. One sentence in a log about what worked and what didn't. Weekly routines, 1 to 2 hours. Skill focus. Pick one micro skill, vocal anchor, amplified listening, status projection, and practice it in at least 3 interactions. Relationship architecture review. Update 1 partnerships, 3 commitments sheet. Peer feedback. Ask one trusted colleague for one piece of feedback. Monthly experiments, 2 to 4 hours. Run a controlled experiment. A/B test 2 opening frames in similar meetings, or measure whether a vocal change leads to more questions. Calibration session. Review recordings, with permission, of your meetings and note micro behaviors you want to change. Quarterly rituals. Reassess your network map. Who are your high-leverage relationships? Who needs structure? Ethical audit. Ask whether any influence tactics feel coercive or misaligned with mutual value. Recommitment. Set a learning goal for the next quarter, e.g., better cross-cultural calibration, deeper conflict resolution skills. A few guardrails to keep influence ethical and durable. Always obtain consent for recordings or public endorsements. Use verification. Pilot projects should have measurable KPIs and exit clauses. Avoid promises you can't keep. Influence should expand mutual options, not bind people. When using reciprocity, allow refusal without penalty. Final practice tasks. Wrap up. Create a 1-page social intelligence playbook that lists your top 3 micro-habits and the people or contexts you'll apply them to. Choose one relationship to architect this month. Send a short note proposing your 3 commitments and invite co-creation. Schedule a 30-minute reflection at the end of the week to assess progress against the daily and weekly routines, a closing ethical reminder, and an invitation. There is power in seeing the patterns behind human behavior. That power can open doors, scale ideas, and create platforms for contribution. But power without checks is dangerous. I built my approach around a simple moral test. Does this act create more agency for the other person or less? If it creates agency, proceed. If it constrains choice or exploits vulnerability, stop. You will encounter moments where influence tempts shortcuts. Resist the easy rush. Short-term wins built on manipulation erode trust and reputations. Long-term success, the kind that compounds into sustainable opportunity, comes from practices that make others better off as they help you. If this story has given you a new frame for how to approach people, I encourage you to translate insight into action. Start with the simple exercises in this audio: 2-minute grounding, 1 reciprocity gesture, a relationship architecture note, and let repetition turn them into habit. If you'd like the workbook that contains the exercises and templates from this audiobook, a concise tool you can use to apply these skills, download it from the episode notes. It includes checklists, the quadrant templates for adaptive communication, and sample email and meeting scripts you can personalize. When I began, I thought my greatest barriers were technical: product features, pricing models, market size. Over time, I realized the larger barrier was social. How to move people so that value could be realized. Learning to read signals, regulate my state, influence ethically, and build structures for trust changed not only my outcomes, but my experience of work. Meetings became less draining and more generative. Relationships became more durable. Opportunities surfaced because networks trusted the way I showed up. This is not a program for manipulation. It's a practice for alignment, aligning competence with social fluency so that good ideas find the people who can act on them. If you take one thing from what I've shared, let it be this: attention and ethical intention compound. Small, honest acts repeated over time create disproportionate influence, And with that influence comes responsibility. If this message helped you see human behavior differently, subscribe to the series for deeper modules and case studies, or download the full workbook to begin your practice plan. The habits are modest. The results, if you commit, can be durable. Thank you for listening. Show up curious, act with integrity, and build systems that scale trust. The social language that once felt mysterious can become one of your most reliable tools if you practice it day after day with humility and care.